ghosts, psychics, pendulums, curses, hexes. We welcome you here to Friday Night Dark in the realm of the night. Come join us and listen to this week's presentation, and we bid you welcome.
Good evening. This is Drew, and I welcome you back to Friday Night Dark. Hey, tonight, I want to talk about poltergeists. Despite the scene painted from a well known movie, there is a lot of lore around the subject. Let's talk about the word itself first. The term poltergeist comes from combining two words from the German language, poltern, which translates to crash or noise, and then geist, which is a spirit or ghost. So you have this crash or noise and ghost, which is the literal translation. So in context, a noisy ghost. Um, and so you have this unruly, noisy ghost that causes, all kinds of incidents. And although less common than traditional hauntings, there are reports of poltergeist activity that date back to the first century AD. Um, there was one by Pliny, the Roman author, who recorded one of the first notable ghost stories in his letters, which became famous for a specter of an old man with a long beard, rattling chains and disturbing the dwelling itself. How many caricatures have you probably seen? Or perhaps maybe we could talk about Charles Dickens and the Christmas Carol, because the very first ghost he encounters is his partner, Marley, and it was Marley who was mired in chains and he was rattling them and making all kinds of noise. So this cartoonish figure of a ghost, regardless, has permeated into not only more popularly known literature, but also has been recorded throughout the ages. This is what people would think of. And even if you go to Disneyland, the very last ride, the hitchhiking ghosts in the haunted mansion, should I say, you have that one guy that's got the ball and chain, he's got the beard, and he's hitchhiking. Yes, I know it sounds weird, but hey, I just want to paint the picture for that one. I wonder if they still have that there. I got away from that. Let's continue on. Now, the subject, despite its notoriety in history, it's kind of wrought also in hoaxes and frauds. And I know it sounds sad, but it is true. There are a few reasons I found poltergeist overall and its notorious nature to be various in its definition and its stories or whatnot. This one was kind of hard to root through because, again, I mean, it was very hard for me to kind of get to the root level of what would be a poltergeist. And I'm not alone in this because parapsychologists overall can't agree on what poltergeists really are. Now, there are some telltale points that we'll certainly touch on, but there hasn't been any total agreement. And I find that part in itself fascinating. So, well, let's go ahead and try to touch on this a little bit more. So, some folks say that poltergeist activity is energy attached to land, or it could be attached to an object or even a spot. Now, others will say that it's actually attached to a person or persons. Now, there are the people that will go after this, the naysayers and the skeptics, who will say it's really just people that are attention seeking. And I want to put that in there, not in the sense of like I'm, debunking the subject. I'm not. Here is something where I had to keep to my rule of that third side. That means you have, one side, you have the other, and then there's what it is. To me, what it is I don't think it's just one of these situations. I think that it's actually all three. I don't know. But I mean, that's my opinion from the way it looks. Maybe perhaps you have someone who is, pining to be, talked to, yearning to be looked at, that has these experiences, And they happen to be in a place that is cultivating that kind of energy to be able to produce this type of phenomenon. That's the way I'm looking at it. But I digress. Let's explore this a little bit. And then maybe we can see for ourselves, and then you can be the judge about what's going on. One thing that's commonly mentioned about poltergeists is that they tend to prefer women over men. And with few exceptions, folks recorded events with poltergeist activity frequently noted a woman or a girl in the midst of these events. Let's take a look at a very infamous movie that was directed by a very well known director. And I know you heard that voice that I had in the background there earlier. That movie itself does depict a small girl who was the focal point for the entities who were basically intrusively interrupting a whole family's life. And so, in that instance, I did find out that there were, in fact, people who did and were investigated along those same guidelines, except their house didn't get sucked up by some void. They moved, they went away. But keeping focus to it, there was a girl in the midst of it. And the parapsychological term for someone who is a focus point for, say, said poltergeist activity is called an agent. And that somehow was a cause for this. I want to assert that I'm not sexist. I'm sure, but this is what is mentioned in many places that I looked at. They always tended to be, female in nature, and I wondered why. But more often than not, these reported events would occur mostly where women were the focal point. And so when I asked someone about this once, they kind of gave me a brief explanation. They said that uh, women have a superior construction of their brain versus men for one reason. They can think simultaneously with both sides of their brain. And they think that might be part of the actual reason why. It's one of the reasons why you also see that there tend to be more women with, say, neurological functions that have problems, say, like, a bipolar or an epileptic type of issue happening. But there are exceptions. There are men who have these same types of issues. Does it mean that it's weighted one more towards the other? No, I don't think so. But I think that because of that same definition, it's there. But I'm giving this kind of a supporting reason why some people tend to think. I don't really necessarily agree, but then again, I'm not a neurologist, so I can't really, give you a professional judgment. I'll let you be the judge. So let's talk about some of the examples that I did find. One famous case debated hotly in the 70s was Doris Bither. Now, there was a woman who claimed to have been repeatedly assaulted by an invisible entity, and it was done on such a frequent basis that at some point I know that the Child Protective Services came to visit her a couple of times because they thought something else was going on. She invited the investigation of a parapsychologist to investigate her case, and it's one that's captured my imagination for a lot of reasons. And one is that you have something that you can't see that's doing things to not only the center, a woman in this case, uh, but also affecting a family. And much like that infamous movie of the 80s that a lot of people know, what people don't realize is that there were a lot of things taken from that case that fueled that movie. As a matter of fact, the parapsychologist that investigated the case was also made fun of on that movie. But I digress. Now, there is another one in 1967 at a lawyer's office in Rosenheim, Germany. A strange thing started happening in the presence of a 19-year-old secretary. Her name was Anna Marie Chabrol. I think I said that right. But in both cases that I'm mentioning here, there was a lot of questionable circumstances and strong psychological issues, such as bipolar disorders, which were suspected to be more explainable causes. Now, here's the weird part in both of these: there were events that were unexplained in both of them. And despite the fact that there were folks that investigated it and said, they're probably, doing things, they're just attention seeking. what they did say also at the same time is there was some phenomena that they just couldn't explain. Now, one mention from an investigator was that most of the aforementioned here, like I said, not only did they say that there were things that were fake, but they also had substantiated events of things moving, things disappearing, things. Even when they were investigating, there was tools that they had that could not be found later. They just disappeared. And I think that's interesting because in all those things, not only were they contested to be hoaxes, if you will, but at the same time, they said there was a lot of things that went on. They had a lot of similarities in that, and I just want to emphasize that fact. So, are these poltergeist attacks? Are these activity of this sort? What caused them? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment, but it does make you wonder a little bit. Now, I'm not sure, as I did find a few, guys and boys and whatnot that actually did have some issues there, but those tended to be really short lived. And there again makes me wonder if that whole brain thing might be part of this whole process. Don't know. Now, I found that some folks could not agree about some of these circumstances, and there are other things that occur when a poltergeist manifests. Now, let's look at some other aspects about what I'm talking about. It has been noted that poltergeists like to mess with your stuff, and it's been said that poltergeist activity typically starts with a minor isolated incident. That means there's a buildup to it, much like someone puts a pot of water on a stove. It doesn't boil immediately. It actually, takes time. Now, if it's subtle or gradual, that's one thing, but say missing or misplaced keys could start the process, maybe even a comb or a hairbrush. So, how many times in a house you might hear, "Honey, where's my toothbrush?" Or maybe, "Hey, where's the remote control?" Well, that's precisely what's happening here. This could include unexplained sounds or maybe familiar objects such as your keys or your phone moving from their usual place or even disappearing more often. Now, for me, I would probably tell you no, that's not the case because I constantly forget where I put my keys. I also constantly forget where I put my phone. So I can't say this is truly the case for me, but I do have that watch. Oh, wait, where did my watch go? In some instances, I know that if you have these examples, show up, and if there are frequent reports of objects moving on their own, it's very possible you might be experiencing something like this, and also being found where they're not supposed to be. Let's just say, the keys show up in a pantry, and your cereal box shows up in the refrigerator, or was that just me? I don't know. I know it sounds kind of cool, but maybe not. I mean, it's kind of irritating, especially if you wake up and you're late for work. Let's say your alarm clock didn't go off because it went missing. I could think of a lot of different reasons. How would you report that to your boss? "I'm late, sir, because the poltergeist took my alarm clock." Okay. Uh, But while poltergeist activity is typically short lived, manifestations typically lasting around a few months at most, there are some cases that have persisted for several years. Let me give you a couple examples there. One that comes to mind is the Calvados Castle that's in Normandy, France. Now, from October 12th of 1875 to September of 1876, the castle was subject to a series of supernatural events so terrifying that the owners were eventually compelled to flee the premises. And I know that a lot of castles tended to be like deserted over time, but I know a lot of them are still inhabited by the royalty of, say, like the UK or what have you. But there are ones that are just sitting there. I was asked once if I would actually, live in one and like renovate it if I could. And I was like, well, it would take a ton of cash, but I wouldn't mind doing it. Maybe I'll consider that like a bucket list thing. But I digress. Though it had been the setting for unexplained noises and mysterious occurrences for about a decade beforehand, it was on the night of October 12th, as it says here, in 1875, that the forces lurking within the castle finally had let loose on their fury. The furniture started moving around, objects went hurtling through the air, and heating appliances malfunctioned. On top of that, there were loud crashing noises as if some gigantic and unseen being was banging on the walls of the building. Those blows were so loud and so intense that not only did they wake the entire household, but it literally shook the very castle itself to its foundations. That's pretty powerful, you ask me. If something like that could build up to that example, yeah, I would question it just a little. But again, here is one of the things that I found makes me think that there could be something else with this, right? Remember when I mentioned ball lightning and that incident where an event took place in front of like a monastery or a church and it exploded and it took out a huge chunk of that particular place? Would this be like one of that? I mean, you have something where you have loud noises and crashing, so could that have been ball lightning? Now, it is a natural phenomenon, but here again, it'd be questionable. But I would probably want to let it stand for what it is. But I keep thinking of that movie that Spielberg made. Um, the castle, the episode lasted for only a short while, but this was basically a little bit over, almost about a year. But in some cases, because the buildup was so long, it was considered a very long case. And I know the movie with Spielberg itself was very short, but I'm sure that was Hollywood saying you can't take 10 years to tell the story. um, but it does make me wonder if ghosts go to concerts and come back wired up, perhaps. I don't know. Now, there was another incident in 1716. There was the Epworth Rectory haunting. And according to legend, the Reverend Samuel Wesley and his wife and their 19 children. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he had 19 kids. Wow, what a household. But they lived in Epworth Rectory in Lincolnshire, and they say that on Christmas Day of 1716, the family initially reported mysterious sounds such as loud knocking and noises, which were thought to be the work of the ghost of their eldest daughter. Uh, they nicknamed Old Jeffrey. I have to wonder, why did they name their kid Jeffrey? But I kept thinking about those agents because, again, this was a gal passed on, but somehow, for whatever reason, they blamed her. Um, Why'd they name her Jeffrey? Anyway, it the one thing that makes me look back on what I was saying before about the agents themselves of a poltergeist type of event being women, they never mentioned if the woman or the gal involved, if they happen to be deceased. The ones beforehand were always living. So does that mean that perhaps it might extend beyond that? Who knows? But it is believed that spirits could be the dead that cause these poltergeist activities, which is why I brought in that old Jeffrey definition and explanation. And in some cases, many people believe that the spirits of the dead are responsible for poltergeist activity. This is said to be because people who experience them perceive an underlying intelligence and meaningful communication with an otherworldly being. This view proposes that a disembodied consciousness or a soul survives bodily death. And I know that sounds weird to put this in the middle of a poltergeist type of a segment, but it does go back to that movie. I know I keep going back to it because I think it's easy to make reference because, in a way, they kind of touch on some of the things that I'm mentioning here. Maybe it's kind of an underlying subconscious thing I'm giving here for you to watch the movie. And maybe you might even look at it a little differently if you do happen to watch it. But I will make mention of Poltergeist, the movie here itself, because I will assume that if you've seen it, then you'll know what went on there. And if not, well, there's going to be spoilers. But this is probably the big point that I'm making with this. They built houses that were on top of a graveyard, if you remember. And they were, really honestly, they probably were plenty ticked off that they were their final resting place that they probably had, sunk a ton of cash into, now has been disturbed and turned into a housing development. It's kind of like, you live in a neighborhood and it's that modern and very peaceful embodiment of suburbia. And then all of a sudden, there's a whole bunch of apartments across the street from where you live almost overnight. That's basically the way it would look. So, of course, you're going to have people who take offense to it. And they didn't have any say in the matter. So, when you go back to the whole thing that happened, with the other folks, you have to wonder if this disembodied person or, these entities, even with Doris Bither, were they people that had some kind of axe to grind, if you will, with the intended targets? Who knows? But there again is, part of what's going on here. But there is a notion about this in real life. Now, let's back up for a second, because I want to look at it from the point of an occultist point of view. A disembodied spirit or supernatural force credited with certain malicious or disturbing phenomena, such as inexplicable noises and sudden and wild movements or breakage in your household, is a direct result of someone who might have something that's gone on that was traumatic. And in some cases, poltergeists are blamed for those violent actions. So there could be a relationship. And so I would want to point that out. Now, I know this seems repetitive, but in this case, it's not some random or uncontrolled energy, but a person or persons perhaps that's causing all of this. And that's why I keep going back to the movie, because if you look at the arc that they had for the movies that people might know, or just a single movie, you hear some of these things kind of get touched on. Even that famous lady who clears their house will tell you the same thing, is that it was a bunch of people, or that focused it around a certain leader, and they all wanted this girl. So you basically have a combination of all three, as I had mentioned before. And look at it from that point of view, is that one person can say, it's a fraud. Yeah, the insurance company didn't buy what happened to their house. But the other thing I would point out here is that you had a place that had disembodied spirits that were disturbed. Now, they could be events from, anger or residual energy of intense emotion. Who knows? But here's why I step back on my explanation about all this. There is that case of George Mackenzie and the Black Mausoleum. Back in the 1600s, there were some laws that were passed to enforce a state-sponsored liturgy, which were viciously enforced by Mackenzie himself. The behavior and vigorous convictions of the people gave him kind of a nefarious reputation. This guy was not someone to be trifled with by any means. He didn't have a sense of humor, from what they said. And honestly speaking, even if you were, jesting with him over things unrelated, he somehow found it a way to enforce his law on you if you ticked him off. So obviously, this was someone you just didn't mess with, period. But it's said that when Mackenzie died, he was entombed in a mausoleum in the Greyfriars Kirkyard. And that's the very same graveyard where he had prosecuted those who resisted the law and ultimately executed. Now, it's said that his mausoleum had been the site of a number of desecrations. For obvious reasons, I'm sure no one really liked the guy. I could only imagine some of the things that went on. Now, here's the weird part, is that they also said that as much as that there was, these weird events that took place, they kind of stayed within the mausoleum itself. That is until recently. In 1999, there was a homeless man who sought shelter in the mausoleum itself, had nowhere to go. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't necessarily want to see myself, being homeless. But worse, I would very much question the idea if I'd want to be in a mausoleum. Now, don't get me wrong. If I was doing an investigation and I was given an opportunity to investigate a mausoleum, different story. But if that became home for me, I don't know. I think that would probably be a little disturbing. But this homeless man, he sought shelter there. And when he got in, he fell to the floor. And there's a hole that can still be seen there. But this is where it gets weirder, is that he fell through the floor and there were bodies in there. Like tons of dead people, I mean, the bones of them that were there. So imagine this guy, he falls to the floor, he sees all this stuff and he's flipping out. And he gets out. Obviously, he's now, running around. But they say ever since that happened, the activity in that area increased. So he disturbed the tomb of a very nefarious person, a well known person that, with his notorious nature, should I say, that not only was there like a little bit of activity, but now it's like he opened Pandora's box. And some say the activity not only increased by a lot, but it also became the focus of a lot of local superstition, things that you just didn't do. So I understand necessity sometimes can be the reason why people will do things. And it can cause things that can be very violent. But I also would point out that without that motivation, you obviously wouldn't have these stories. But the other thing that I would largely point out is that the ghostly activity increased once it was disturbed. And much like that movie, people kind of try to stay away from it as much as possible. And in some cases, people said that when they happened to be by it, they had gotten physical harm, including scratches and bruises. And they attributed it to Mackenzie's ghost, but it had become a poltergeist because it had this angry energy attached to it. And since it was a horrific death that some of these people had suffered, it is said that he, in fact, is being assaulted by these folks, and they are the focus of he is the focus of their anger, should I say? So anything close by is kind of like caught in the crossfire. I definitely can see that, but is it poltergeist activity? Don't know. But again, we're touching on this in such a way that I have to wonder if, in fact, there are things that could make this one or the other. Is it just something that is attached to the land itself? Is it really a disembodied person? Or perhaps maybe it could be circumstances. I don't know. Now, for me, I'm sure this is one of those times when I have to really think about it. It does bring up that question if poltergeists can defy physics. Do you think perhaps maybe they could be real? I don't know. I can't say for sure. I think they contribute some very terrific stories, if anything else. But when I say very terrific stories, I don't necessarily mean that they're not true. I know that in my life, I've seen a few things that I couldn't explain. And I know people probably wouldn't believe me. But at the same time, I would probably also tell people, there's something that might be a reason for people to perceive it. There a long time ago, someone told me that if you saw a rainbow, that the one that you see, and if there was someone standing next to you, would be two different rainbows because they're two separate perceptions. And I think that's part of what goes on here. I think that perhaps maybe there could be a reason that overlaps between the perceptions of people who might not think this is a good thing and people that would say, oh, yeah, they're definitely real. A lot of unexplained phenomena that takes place. But in all the examples I've given you today, I would like you to just bear in mind that these are all related in one way to a person, place, or thing. And in a lot of instances, despite the fact that some can be explained away, there are a lot of things that can't be. And I think this means that we should bear just a little respect for what a poltergeist could be. When we finally get that melted down empirical definition of what a poltergeist is supposed to be, maybe we can talk about this further. But for tonight's session, I hope that somewhere in there it gives you fuel to talk about what goes on, or perhaps maybe you watch a movie. For me, well, I'm hoping that when you talk about or you see these things, that you might reach out and talk to me. Or perhaps maybe you might even leave a message where you've heard this. Where would you reach out to? Friday Night Dark at nighttracks.com. And as I said, you could leave a message below. But what do you think? Let me know. And I'll let you be the judge. With that, this is Drew, and I bid you good night.
Thanks for listening to Friday Night Dark. We ask you to visit otherworldly exhibits and see many spectacular special effects they offer. There are classes and events held often to see for yourself what makes these special effects come to life. Just click on the link below to learn more. Thanks again for your listenership here at nitrax.com.